Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you are watching this, and welcome back to this week's episode of Since I Was Young, a podcast dedicated to all things Heart of Midlothian. Now, this afternoon, I was planning on coming to you to discuss the Dundee fixture that took place yesterday at time of recording, yesterday afternoon at Tynecastle. However, of course, over the last, less than 24 hours at this point, things have changed, and the club have made a decision that we will obviously talk about as we go along. It's just myself this week that you're unfortunately stuck with just my company this week, but please do feel free to get in the comments below and give me your thoughts on anything that I discuss and any points that I bring up during this week's episode. Before we get started, as per usual, folks, whilst you're down there leaving a comment, please do feel free to subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can also find us on Spotify at Since I Was Young Podcast. All of our social channels are in the description on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, the whole lot, TikTok, Blue Sky. We're across all of them. So yeah, obviously there's lots to talk about with recent events at Tynecastle. So if you wish to get in touch, please do so on those channels. Now, with all that said and done, obviously the main topic of conversation today will be the managerial situation that Hearts have found themselves in. Now, I want to just take it back and kind of touch on the Dundee fixture, because I feel like that is the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. For the last few weeks, obviously, pressure has been mounting on Neil Critley, and of course, after the Dundee defeat, that pressure proved too much, and the club have acted and removed him from his post, as well as his assistant Mike Garrity, both men being relieved of their duties yesterday evening, following the defeat, as I say, at the hands of Dundee. Now, to take it back to obviously the pre-kickoff against Dundee, obviously everybody had spoken about how big a game it was following the semi-final loss to Aberdeen, and the manner of that loss to Aberdeen. I think a lot of people, and we spoke about it last week, about when I was on with John, spoke about the sort of the situation with the manager being black or white, whether he won or lost the game against Aberdeen, that would define his future. It came out rather grey, which is what the Heart Standard referred to it as, and I think, as I said last week, that was a perfect kind of description, because obviously the manner of the defeat allowed him maybe an extra week to hang on in there and maybe kick the can down the road a little bit. However, the game against Dundee was a massive game, obviously, the first of our post-split fixtures. Everybody obviously felt, you know what, we've had Dundee's number this season. We beat them 6-0 last time out away from home. So this is a winnable tie at Tynecastle. And so it should have been. Obviously, Neil Critchley changed the system away from his favoured diamond that we've seen over the last few weeks. He finally chose to change the system. Could that be due to players available to him? Perhaps. Obviously, Captain Lauren Shankland chose to sit in the stands yesterday rather than be on the pitch. But again, I'll dive into that as we go. So he opted for a 4-2-3-1. Now, on paper, I like the system, I like the shape, but the problem that I have with it, and as the game played out, the problem that was evident was that Elton Kabangu was up front by himself, with a lack of real support, a lack of players getting up to help him, a lack of players getting into the box to, be on the end of crosses or, arriving late in the box to have shots. There wasn't any of that. And that's something that we've seen over the last few weeks and months, really, is a lack of that clinical end product. And that has ultimately been what has cost Neil Critchley his job, or one of the reasons that it has cost Neil Critchley his job. But to be fair to him, he chose to change the system when a lot of people were hoping he would. He did. The game against Dundee, I'm not going to go into too much detail on it because I don't really think it needs it. I think obviously the main talking point is what happened after the game. But the game against Dundee played out in the most predictable, scripted way you could imagine. Dundee came to Tynecastle well aware of the fan unrest, well aware of the feeling around Tynecastle at the moment and its fan base, the Hearts fan base. They came with a plan, which was sit in, defend, frustrate, and take a chance when we get one, because inevitably we will get a chance, and that's exactly what happened. We started the game okay, but again, as I said, there was a lack of that penetration, a lack of that killer final touch. George Grant had a chance that the goalkeeper had to make a smart save from, but aside from that, there wasn't really a lot to write home about from Hearts in the first half. Obviously, Dundee score with Simon Murray. I can't stand Simon Murray, but as much as I'm not a fan of him, he is effective at what he does, and he suits that game plan of take a chance when you get it because he's that kind of striker. So yeah, Dundee went in at the break 1-0 up to a chorus of boos from the stands at Tynecastle, which were a lot more empty than we had previously seen. The club announced 18,000 in attendance, which I find incredibly hard to believe. I think you'd be lucky if there was 15,000 there, but of course, the way attendances are calculated and such, you're never going to know the true figures of the people that were actually in the stadium. But they made their feelings known at halftime, and as is their right to do so. Now, I watched it. I wasn't in attendance. I was watching at home. And I felt like the second half, we needed to see a reaction. We needed to see a response from the players because the first half was pedestrian. It was passive. It was sideways. There was no penetration. There was nobody really willing to break a line and move forward with the ball and try and make something happen in an attacking sense. There was just none of that. They were just devoid of all confidence in that area of the game. So at halftime, I'm hoping that the players come out in the second half and have a reaction and put a bit of fight in and realise that what they're putting on the pitch is not good enough. Um, I would hope that Neil Critchley was going through them in the dressing room. However, I have to be honest, when they came out in the second half, it was more of the same. He made subs at halftime. Again, I'm not going to go through player by player because again, it's not what this is about really. But he made subs at halftime which were ineffective. And Dundee, to be fair to them, put a lot of work in, defended well, but we were just so passive. As I say, there was nothing to us that showed any sort of fight, and that's a big worry. That is a big worry for me, and I'll touch on that after. I'll touch on that shortly. But he then what Neil Critchley then did as the second half progressed was he brought on Jan Danda, a player we've not seen for months. He brought on Alan Forrest, a player we've not seen for months. And he brought on Kenny Vargas, a player we've not seen for months. And now, obviously, these three players all came on with the hope that they would inject some directness and some pace and some energy and some much needed creativity. But it didn't happen. And my thoughts on that are quite simple, really. And this is kind of the first point that I'll make about Neil Critchley because people that have listened to this podcast and have interacted with me on social medias will know that I was a Critchley supporter for a considerable period of time because I felt like what he's inherited and what he's done is better than nothing effectively. And there were some positives to what I saw, but as the weeks have worn on, it's become harder and harder to defend him. And I think one of the biggest issues that I have with the Neil Critchley era, and obviously it doesn't matter now because he's away, he's been removed from the football club, but he chose a diamond system. He went with obviously Blair Spittle and Sander Khartoum as the left and right midfielders in that diamond. Now, those two players are not wingers. They are not wingers in the traditional sense of a winger. They are not quick, direct, pacey players. Blair Spittle has that link up with Penrice, and that's where that width comes from on the left hand side. Sander Khartoum, I'm not going to go heavy on him because he's just in the door, so I don't want to write him off. But I clearly feel like there's a player there that's being played out of position for whatever reason. But yeah, those two just didn't have it. But like I say, Critchley chose to throw on these players that I spoke about previously, Forrest, Danda, and Vargas, in the hope that they would do something. Now, these are players that have not been picked or have not been put on the pitch for a very long time by the manager. And that's due to design of his system. He obviously, when he came on board, he's looked at players like Barry Mackay and thought, right, you know what, you're not what I need, you're not what I want. He sidelined him. Barry Mackay remains at the club, and I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that Barry Mackay would have been an answer yesterday. I'm not even suggesting that somebody like a Yutara Oda would have been an answer yesterday. However, having them as options and backup plan B options when the plan A is not working would have been helpful. Instead, what he did was he stuck with his plan A for such a long time that it becomes a bit stubborn of him, and it becomes, players like Danda, Vargas, and Forrest. And if I was in their shoes, this is how I would feel. I don't know. You can tell me what you think, but if you're a player on the sidelines and you've been on the sidelines for so long, despite training and doing all the things that your manager wants you to do, but you're not getting picked because it's a system thing, you don't fit in. If you're then called upon off the bench to go onto a pitch and make a difference and make an impact, there is putting myself in that situation, putting myself in the shoes of a Kenny Vargas or an Alan Forrest or a Danda. I'm looking at it going, this manager hasn't trusted me for months. So why is he trusting me now? Because he has no other option. So there is an element of that to me, that's how I read it. But they came on and very little happened in the game, I have to be honest. And it obviously petered out into a 1-0 defeat that dropped us down to eighth place, just 5 points above the relegation playoff. And again, that's a big concern, obviously. Like I spoke about previously about the fight and the lack of fight in this team. The big question I have, and this is something that's been mentioned to me by a lot of people, and I had lots of conversations about it, and my brother and I spoke about it recently as well. The issue I have with this potential relegation playoff and the fact that a lot of people over the last few weeks have been saying, "Oh, we're not. That's not a danger. The last 5 games are meaningless. The last 5 games, it's just get us to the end of the season, get the season finished." These next 4 games are not meaningless. These next 4 games are massive, and we know Neil Critchley's record in big games stood against him, and it did. That was another negative in the Neil Critchley column, which there were a lot of, and it's understandable why people level that at him. I spoke a couple of weeks ago about my thoughts in terms of the players not receiving enough criticism, and I still stand by that. I think even now more so than ever, I think people need to point the finger at these players and say they have got 2 managers sacked in one season. Neil Critchley lasted 6 months before he was removed. 6 months of a 3-year deal, which I'll touch on kind of as we progress, because I have some thoughts on the board as well, which I'll probably wrap up with. But yeah, the game against Dundee became so predictable and obvious that that's how it was going to go, that it wasn't even a surprise when the full-time whistle went and it was 1-0 Dundee and we'd lost and slipped down to eighth place. As I say, the lack of fight, the lack of passion, the lack of response is a worry, though. And the reason I'm worried is because the teams in the bottom 6 with us are there quite frequently. The Ross Counties, the St Johnstones, the Dundees, even the Motherwells to an extent. They have been in this position before where they have to scrap for points to survive before the end of a season. We have not been in that position. We are much more used to being in that top 6, and when the split fixtures come around, it's either, well, they're meaningless because we can't finish second, or they're meaningless because we can't finish any higher than, say, fourth or fifth. That tends to be how the post split goes for Hearts. We don't tend to take it seriously because we don't normally need to. But these teams below us at the moment, they know how to fight, they know how to scrap. We need to learn and learn quick that these next 4 games are massive. And Liam Fox, who's obviously been put in temporary charge till the end of the season, I would imagine, has a big job on his hands to get it right and to get these players back going again, because they need to. But yeah, then obviously, as I say, after full time, slightly after, came the news that Neil Critchley had been removed from post. I felt like something might have happened after the Dundee game, and I felt like the atmosphere at Tynecastle, again, I wasn't in attendance on the day, but I know a couple of people that were, and they spoke about how toxic it felt in Tynecastle, and it's never nice. And when the fans turn on you, your time as is up effectively. And that's obviously what has happened. I thank Neil Critchley for his time. I thank him for his service. He came in when we had 2 points and we were sitting bottom of the table, so he's got points on the board. And this is kind of the pro Neil Critchley, and the one thing that I clung to for so long, and then obviously lost patience with it, was that point of he came in and we collected points. We did get some points on the board. We did climb up the table. But let's be realistic, we never really touched top 6 comfortably enough to say that that's us, secured in top 6. The team had chances to secure top 6 and they didn't do it. That's down to management, it's down to players, it's down to all of them. The footballing department in general have failed this season. There have been multiple failings this season that date prior to Neil Critchley coming on board. Some could even argue that Neil Critchley coming on board was a failure from the board, but we'll talk about that at the end. But yeah, it's. I had a feeling that something would have happened with Neil Critchley after Dundee, because usually, obviously, the club will post up the post-match comments from the manager on the socials. That didn't happen. He did his behind closed doors press conference that the Heart Standard attended, and there were a few questions levelled at him in terms of understanding fan criticisms and understanding how things are, and what he plans to do about it. And Neil Critley uttered the phrase that many a doomed man has uttered, and that is, "I believe I'm the man to turn it around." And then only a few hours later, it was announced that he was no longer in post. But the club, like I said, the club didn't upload any manager comments to their social medias. They normally put a little clip on Twitter of the manager, either standing in the tunnel or standing on the pitch with a microphone giving his thoughts. We didn't see that yesterday. And when we didn't see that, that was when I felt as if something was going to happen. To be fair, I think, like I said, patience had run out, and the Dundee game, as I said at the start, was the straw that broke the camel's back, and that was it. Neil Critchley removed from post. I feel sorry for Neil Critchley in a way, and again, this is kind of takes me into my next direction. I feel sorry for him in a way because what he inherited is a club, or is a group of players, that the balance of that team was all wrong. The summer recruitment was all wrong. Stephen Naismith obviously built a team in a certain way, tried to keep everybody happy, couldn't manage it, didn't get results on the pitch, got sacked. Neil Critchley, in a way, you could say, alienated that plan B, like I spoke about, the wide players. He obviously didn't have them on his side when he needed them because of the system and because of how stubborn he was with that system. But Neil Critchley came in at a time when the club was at a real low, but there were still opportunities for him to get fans on side, you know, failing to get through in Europe when again we had it in our hands, failing to see wins over the line like the Ross County fixture. That's one that sticks in my memory and will forever and a day stick in my memory. A lack of fight shown in derbies is not acceptable for any Hearts manager at any level, any Hearts player at any level as well. There has to be an element of fight in a derby, and we've not shown it this season. And congratulations to Hibs and fair play to them. They deserve to be where they are. David Gray has turned it round brilliantly there, and I applaud him for that. As much as it pains me to do that, but I do. We have not. We've had opportunities to get forward. We've had opportunities to climb the table, and we've been our own downfall. Injuries, I will say, in Neil Critchley's defence, haven't helped him. Not being able to pick a consistent side, a defensive line that had to change multiple times. You want a settled partnership at the back. You want as many settled partnerships on the pitch as you can have. We have had injuries to big players this season, which have hampered the team due to the changing nature of it, and that's one of those things that is unavoidable. But yeah, I feel like the time is right for the time was right for Neil Critchley to go. There were people obviously shouting for it after the semi-final. I felt like, you know what, the Dundee game's a big one. He needs to get a result there. I had my thoughts about the semi-final and the way we set up in that game, as did John, that we spoke about last week. And again, there were question marks against Dundee, and the pressure that came, it just all became too much. And, like I said, I applaud Neil Critchley and I thank him for coming in when he did and doing what he managed to do. But the fact of the matter is this, with 4 games to go, there is still a possibility that we end up in a relegation playoff. And that, for a club the size of Hearts, would be a disaster. I don't think anyone can deny that. Sitting here today, do I think that we will end the season in a relegation playoff? I don't. But it's a realistic possibility. So I can't rule it out. I have confidence that we won't end up in there. I think we will get enough points over the next 4 games. But I can't say for certain. And that's the worry. And that will be what the board are thinking. Can we believe that this man is the man to get us out of this? Have we seen evidence that he can? We've got 4 massive games and he's not managed to win a big game yet this season. So I can understand where the doubts come from, and that's where it came from for me. I as I said, I've been a Critchley. I don't want to say a Critchley fan because I've seen both sides of the argument. Obviously, if you've listened to this podcast over the last few weeks and months, Ewan has always been a bit of a Critchley skeptic, whereas I kind of tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. But that ran out, and I think, as I said, the correct decision was made yesterday evening to remove him. But looking beyond that now, apologies if my throat's a little bit sore and the audio might not be great on this week's episode. I'm suffering from a higher than normal pollen count in Edinburgh at the moment, so I'm kind of all over the place. But yeah, but back on track. Looking beyond Neil Critchley and what comes next, obviously, as I say, Liam Fox is in charge for the next 4 games. We need a reset. Andrew McKinley spoke about significant change in the summer in terms of recruitment, in terms of playing staff. He spoke about significant change. Those are the words he used. The club needs it. And the longer Neil Critchley was in charge and Ewan and myself exchanged messages about it, this is not the man to lead us into that summer of change. I didn't feel inspired enough by him. I didn't feel like he really got what the expectations and the pressures were. I just don't feel like he was ever really a Hearts manager, if that makes sense. Like he had a long time to stamp his DNA on that team, and we never really saw it, at least not convincingly, for whatever reason. But like I say, it all adds up to the correct decision being made by the board. And I think it's probably the one time in a long time that I've looked at them and went, yes, do you know what? Well done. That's the correct call. Kicking the can further down the road and giving them another week would have just added to the unrest, added to the toxicity, and added to that difficult nature of things at Hearts at the moment. So the board have given themselves one positive point. But I'll kind of speak about the board a little bit now. I feel like a lot of people, and this is a common thing that I've heard a lot of people say, the board have had a good few managers now under this current regime. Have we had a successful one? You would argue Robbie Nielsen was successful, but then was removed. Stephen Naismith was an experiment that didn't work. Daniel Stendhal was an experiment that didn't work. Ian Cathro was an experiment that didn't work. Austin McPhee was an experiment that didn't work. Robbie Nielsen is probably the best of a bunch of average managers. And I like Robbie Nielsen. I've always liked him. But, when you're looking at it and saying Robbie Nielsen is the best Hearts manager in terms of win percentages that we've had for quite some time, it kind of shows you where we are and where we're at. The board need to have a look at themselves. And for me, this is the failing, and talking about sort of failings and stuff of Critchley, there's been failings at board level as well. When you finish in a European place, you should then be building for the next season to improve and get better. And yeah, we all know Scottish football is a bit of a closed shop outside of the top two. That's the top two, they fight it out every year. Inevitably, Celtic win the league and Rangers finish in second. Behind that, third place is always up for grabs if you're up for it and prepared and have the quality to do it. This season, we haven't, but we have previously. We've regressed under this board at certain points when you should be looking at it going, this club is making record profits. This club is turning over millions. We're in very good financial health. Why is that not translating to on the pitch? That's the point that a lot of people make, and I can understand that. I can see that it's a difficult one. The board have to balance it, but like I said, if you finish in European football one season, you should then be investing in your team and going again the next year and improving and trying to establish yourself as that top three side, as that third force. That's what you should be doing. That's what an ideal world football club is. You build every year, you don't get worse. You might sell a player or two, but you reinvest and you reinvent. Aberdeen have done it with Majowski. They sold Majowski for a profit, a massive profit. They then gave the manager the money and he went and invested it in players that have improved them. Hibs have done it. Hibs had a bit of a scattergun approach to recruitment, but they've hit a formula that works for them. And, I don't like to sit here being jealous of Hibs because I'm absolutely not, but I look at it and I go, I'll use Aberdeen as the example. That's what you should be doing. What Hearts seem to do is finish in third place, shout and ball about being back in Europe, produce merchandise about being in Europe, make a big song and dance about being on a European tour, but they don't back who's in the dugout with the players to make the team better, and that for me is a big problem. We've said it many times about right back as a prime example. Michael Smith has been away from Hearts for a couple of years now, and we've not had a better right back since Michael Smith. You could talk even more about players like Josh Ginnelly. I know he divided opinion, but he was a very good, effective player at what he did. We've never replaced that with a player of even close to his ability, and that is a failing at the footballing level, the football model level. The footballing department is the correct expression that I'm looking for there. So there have been failings, and obviously the footballing department has been revamped with Graham Jones coming on board and Joe Savage leaving. Another man that I place a lot of blame for this season at is the feat of Joe Savage and Stephen Naismith, to be fair. But John and I and Ewan and I have spoken a lot about that over the last few weeks and months, so I'm not gonna dive into that. But there have been significant failings across the footballing department at Hearts over the last 12 to 18 months. What comes next? We're asking this board to appoint a manager that can take us in the right direction. That is what comes next. Do you trust the board to make that decision correct? Or are we going to be going round in circles with Liam Fox as the manager next season? Again, like I said about a relegation playoff, there's a world where I can see that they do that and they give the job to Liam Fox. I hope not. And it's no harsh, it's no slight on Liam Fox because I like him. But if something like that were to happen, that just smacks of a massive lack of ambition, and that would be levelled at the board once again. Taking it back to when Neil Critchley was appointed, it played out in the public eye. Everybody knew that Hogmo was the first choice, and for whatever reason, he wasn't brought on board, be it financial from his side or the club side. I think there were failings at both sides there. They identified him as the man they wanted to talk to. They had conversations with him. They couldn't agree a wage structure with him or bonuses, I think it was at the time. But if he's your number one target, you've got the money to give him. Just do it. I think the club have to do that now. I think that's the position that we're in. They cannot afford to go for the cheap option. They did it with Neil Critchley. They hyped up that his record of improving players was a big reason why he was in the door at Tynecastle to begin with. I look at the current Hearts squad and I say, is there one man that's improved under his leadership? I can't. I can't suggest that there is. Players have regressed due to the system changes. So that was a negative in the Neil Critchley column. If we're adding them up, if we're tallying them, that's how it's gone. But the board need to identify the man that they want, and they need to go and get it done, because this is a huge summer for Hearts. With the Jamestown recruitment analytics, obviously they'll be involved in the next manager search, I'm sure. And that's fine. I don't have a problem with it. I still don't have a problem with it. I think Jamestown is the way that we're going, and that's how it works. It needs to be done, though. It needs to be done properly. It needs to be done right. The board need to get this next appointment right, using all the tools at their disposal to do that. They can't settle for a cheap option just because he's cheap. People said about Neil Critchley when he was appointed, this is a guy that got Blackpool promoted, then relegated. It wasn't an inspiring appointment. There were fans that were against it right from the start. What the board need to do is find a manager that is going to come in and unite the fan base, because that's what they need. We said it countless times on this podcast that the fan base is one of the best fan bases in the country when things are going well. When things are not going well, like I said earlier, once you lose the fans, you're done. Your time is up, and that's what happened with Neil Critchley, unfortunately, and it's what's happened with some of these players that we currently have as well. I haven't touched too much on the players, but I will in future episodes and things like that when we see a response and we see how things are post Critchley. But let's not forget this group of players have now got two managers sacked in a season, as I mentioned earlier. But back to the board, they need to get the next call right. They need to use all their tools to get the man in that they want, and give them the backing that this group of players, this team needs. We speak about the significant change in the summer. There's a large number of players who are out of contract that I wouldn't cry if any of them left, to tell you the truth. There's one or two that I feel like we should be hanging on to, but a majority of the players I'm looking at and going, would I lose any sleep if you weren't at Hearts next season? Probably not. The club needs a facelift. It needs an overhaul. But I think more than anything else, we need a manager with a proven track record and a winning mentality. Some of the things that Neil Critchley came out with, talking about a draw away against Motherwell being a good result normally, in normal circumstances, that's a good result. The problem is we're not in normal circumstances, and even in normal circumstances, I'm sorry, I'm not celebrating going away to Fir Park and drawing 0-0. That's not the mentality of a Hearts manager. A Hearts manager should be coming in and saying, right, this club is a big club. They play in a capital city. They've got a stadium that is impressive. They've got training facilities that are impressive. What is going wrong? Why is this club where it is? This should not be the case. The next manager needs to come in and rip things up with fresh eyes and say, right, let's move forward. This is time to get back to winning ways and putting Hearts back where they should be. Because let's be honest, I know, third place isn't claimed by balance sheets and it isn't claimed by finances and budgets, but we have the third biggest budget in the country and it has not been managed properly for a very, very long time. So, like I say, whether you trust the board to make the right decision or not, whether you think people above Neil Critchley should also be out the door, please feel free to let me know. My view on that, don't get me wrong, I can see again where people come from when they talk about Andrew McKinlay. I've never really been a big fan of his. I'm not going to dive into the budge debate because I'll leave that for the comments to discuss. But I can understand why people question this board because they have had a lot of opportunities and they've got a lot of things wrong. This managerial decision, this next managerial appointment has to be correct. Do I trust them to make the right call? Time will tell. Hopefully, with this new set of tools and this new system, we can make a more educated appointment and just go out and get the first choice. Don't let it play out in the public domain like the Hogmo situation did, because that became blatantly obvious from day one that Neil Critchley was the second choice. He was not the man that they wanted initially. He was the man they ended up with because he was the cheaper option. Don't let that happen again. If they let that happen again and we end up going down this road again, we could be down this road again in 12 months' time. And nobody wants that. We don't want to become a football club that hire and fire managers willy-nilly, because then the club gets labelled as a poison chalice, that job, and nobody wants it. We want managers to come to Hearts and want to build something here. If that then means in 18 months they get headhunted and move elsewhere, fine. It'll have meant they'll have done a good job for us. But you can let me know your thoughts on the board and on everything else that I've spoken about today. Thank you for listening today, folks. As I say, this was another one of those episodes where I had a plan written up for what I was going to talk about, and then that plan got ripped up with the news of Neil Critchley's departure. So thank you for joining me this afternoon. And who do you want as the next manager? Who would your choice be? Get down in the comments or hit us up on social medias with your thoughts, and we'll share and interact with you across all of those platforms. We've always said that being a supporter of Heart of Midlothian is a roller coaster. It absolutely is. It's full of ups and downs, more downs than ups at the moment. Hopefully, good times are not too far away. Hopefully, fingers crossed. But the most important priority for us right now is to get behind these players. I know it's tough. I know it's difficult because a lot of these players have let themselves down this season, and the club and two managers, but they're here. We've got to get behind them. We've got 4 massive games between now and the end of the season, and we need to get points on the board as soon as possible. Points need to be collected, but they need to be earned because we're in a scrap, make no mistake about it. And the threat of sleepwalking towards a potential relegation playoff should be enough to wake these players up and realise what they're doing is unacceptable. And I hope that Liam Fox goes in and tells them some home truths and says, right, back to basics. Let's start again, because that's what we need. But anyway, I will leave it there for this week, folks. As I said previously, thank you as ever for joining me. And if you've had any thoughts from any of the points that I've raised today, I haven't gone into as much detail as I would like to due to timing concerns. I've not quite got the time to dive into them, but I will do with you and John as we progress through the next few weeks before the end of the season podcast, which should be rather interesting. But yeah, please do leave your comments in the comment section below. And like I said at the start, feel free to find us over on Spotify. Give us a follow over there, Since I Was Young podcast. All of our handles are the same on all social channels just to make it nice and easy to find us. So please do feel free to do so. And yeah, thank you as ever. Let's keep it going. Bye for now.